Because I think the social changes that the First World War brought about, men went to the front and went to fight, women stayed and did jobs that had previously been done by men, at least in part, and also the end of the Victorian era movement into the 20th century meant that women were starting to achieve more things. And this was a recognition that women would be allowed to vote and would be allowed to at least start to join the professions and take up what had previously been men-only jobs. Well, I suspect all the women who came into any of the professions then must have had remarkable tenacity, let alone just probably being downright stubborn. They were the generation that had lived through the First World War, and so at the end of the war they saw an opening up of opportunity for women that had just been denied to any women before that. As you say, they weren't allowed to take degrees in any subject. They weren't allowed to vote, they weren't allowed to stand in Parliament. So all of those things began to open up. But for the women who were living through that, it must have been a time of great hardship, followed by optimism, I suppose, when they started to see things change. Because when they changed quite dramatically.
Yeah.
I think it must be easier to do something, if you're the first, well, one of the first doing it, it must be easier to be part of a group, unless you're a very, very strong personality. But the first women who did this were doing it on their own pretty well. They were only ever doing it in ones or twos for the first few years. And of course there were women like the lady who tried to join Gray's Inn before the 1919 Act, who failed. And she was definitely on her own, trying to change things. There's probably very little difference between male or female students as far as this is concerned. To join the Inn as a student today is about the same cost as it was then.
Oh, is it?
That side of the fees hasn't gone up.
Right.
What has obviously gone up is the cost of going to university. Now I've no idea what that cost in before or just after the First World War. I suspect probably the equivalent of what students have to pay these days.
Possibly, yes.
But joining the Inn, well, it was £80 when I joined in the 80s, and it's only about 100 now, I think. And if I'm wrong, it's not much more than that.
Right.
So the fees, those fees haven't gone up at all, actually.
No, that's interesting.
But that's not any part of
No.
the educational side of
course
things.
not. No.
It's simply the fee to join the Middle Temple or any of the inns.
Right.
Once a student has joined the inn, then all the tuition, the training that the inn gives is for free.
Right. So
The fees to join an inn of court have stayed the same. I don't suppose there was any student grant or of any kind in her day, although she may have won a scholarship. I think any barrister will have done that at some time or another in their career, because that's part of the job. What we believe, what we think, what we feel is no part of the case we do, any more than a surgeon who might have very strong anti-union views wouldn't stop to operate on a union member. And so any practicing barrister, certainly who's done any sort of criminal work or any litigation, will at some stage or another have represented somebody whose views they disagree with, whose opinions they hate. For example, I have a friend who is Jewish. He represented somebody charged with war crimes in the Second World War. It's the whole point of the job we do. You don't have to agree with the person you represent. You're their mouthpiece, you're not their friend. I would think a good deal harder. I would think it would be very difficult in those days to have been accepted by clients,
Oh, right.
by
I
solicitors,
never even thought that.
let alone by colleagues, judges. I suspect actually that the profession would have been more welcoming than the clients, because even in my lifetime, it used to be said by some clients that they didn't want to be represented by a woman. One doesn't hear that sort of thing at all anymore. But I would have thought that a lot of male clients in the 30s and 40s would have been very reluctant to have had their case put forward by a woman advocate.
Right, yes.
It has been a problem, and for some women it's still a problem. You put all the effort into joining the profession, and then if you have a family, if the responsibility for looking after the children falls on the woman, then she can't normally continue in full-time practice uninterrupted, and the difficulty then is getting women to come back in to rejoin or come back to practice after they've had their family. One of the big differences, and again I think this is probably the same for men, for women, was that there was probably a much greater social hurdle, barrier to get over in those days. You would be more likely to go to university, obviously, if your family did. A much smaller proportion of people went to university in those days, tiny percentage. And so that would have tended to mean that if you came from a background with less money, less privilege, then you were less likely to get started on the road to tertiary education and a professional qualification.
Yeah. What sort of impact do you think it made when women, including Elsie Bauman, entered the legal profession as barristers? Because they would have been pioneers.
Well, I think, going back to the last answer, it's the range of people. The broader the range of people, the more diverse the group of people that practice in any profession, the more representative it is, the better it is. And certainly so far as the law is concerned, if the public are to have confidence looking at the legal profession, then the legal profession needs to be a broader range, a more diverse range. And that's what we've worked towards solidly for the last 100 years.